She was 30 years old, worth $3 billion, and she just made the worst mistake of her life in front of everyone. One sentence, 5 words, "Get out of my company." The room went dead silent, and the man she fired, he didn't beg, didn't argue, didn't raise his voice even once. He simply closed his folder, pushed back his chair, and walked out the door. What happened next would cost her millions and teach her something no business school on earth could ever teach. If you're new here, hit that subscribe button right now and turn on notifications. Drop your city and country in the comments below so I can see exactly how far this story has traveled. And if you've ever been disrespected at a job, you gave everything to smash that like button because this one's for you. Go anywhere. You will not want to miss a single second of what comes next. The storm came in from the Gulf 3 days before anyone at North Star Freight Solutions was ready for it. That weather was supposed to be Gavin Mercer's problem, not directly. Anyway, his job title was Senior Project Manager, which in practice meant he was the person responsible for making sure that when things went sideways, they went sideways quietly, quickly, and in a way that the client never had to know about. He had been doing exactly that for 7 years, and he was good at it the way some men are good at things that nobody notices until they stop doing them. He was 32 years old. He had a daughter named Lily, who was 10, and had recently developed a firm opinion that strawberry pancakes were the superior breakfast food. He drove a 4-year-old Ford pickup that needed new rear brakes. He rented a 2-bedroom house in a neighborhood where everybody knew each other and nobody locked their cars, and he left that house every morning at 6:15 and usually didn't come back until Lily was already asleep. That was the life. He had built it carefully, the way you build something you're proud of without quite realizing that you've slowly built it so that the most important parts don't belong to you anymore. On the Wednesday, the storm made landfall along the Gulf Coast. Gavin was in his office at 8 p., staring at a logistics map that was turning red in real time. 3 supplier shipments delayed. One trucking partner had already called to say their yard in Beaumont was flooding. Connecting rail line out of Memphis had suspended overnight service. And in 4 days, North Star was supposed to deliver the first major installment of a contract worth $11 million to a company called Hargrove Industrial that had been a North Star client for nearly a decade. Gavin pulled up his chair, rolled up his sleeves, and started making calls. He reached out to 2 backup carriers he had cultivated relationships with over years, not because North Star had asked him to, but because Gavin Mercer was the kind of man who quietly prepared for disasters that hadn't happened yet. Called the operations manager at Hargrove, directly a man named Phil Delaney, who trusted Gavin more than he trusted most people at North Star's executive level, and told him the truth in plain language. "We've got storm disruption, hitting 3 of our primary routes. I'm working a reroute right now, and I think we can absorb most of the delay. You might see a 36-hour slip on the first installment. I wanted to call you myself before anything in the tracking system." Phil Delaney's response was measured. "I appreciate that, Gavin. Keep me in the loop. Always." He worked through the night. At one point, he ordered food for the 4 members of his team who stayed with him: Marcus from logistics routing, 2 junior coordinators named Dana and Priya, and an older dispatcher named Roy who had worked at North Star almost as long as Gavin had. Roy made terrible coffee and told the same 3 jokes on rotation, and that night, those 3 jokes were the only things that made anybody laugh. By 4 in the morning, Gavin had a recovery plan. It wasn't perfect. Nothing about it was clean or pretty. 2 backup carriers would cost more than North Star had budgeted. 1 rerouting option added mileage that would eat into margin. Plan worked. Hargrove would receive the bulk of their shipment within the modified window. The contract would be preserved, and North Star would lose some money on this delivery while keeping an $11 million relationship intact. He had seen his reflection in the dark office window around 3:30 and genuinely didn't recognize himself for a half second. He hadn't slept. His tie was gone, his collar was open, and there were takeout containers scattered the conference table. Marcus had looked at him from across the table. "You think she's even going to look at this plan?" Gavin had gathered the documents into a folder. That's not my job to wonder about. Just saying, I know what you're saying, Marcus. He knew exactly what Marcus was saying, because Cassandra Wren had been a presence at North Star for 2 years. Now she had acquired the company when she was 28 and had spent her first 18 months restructuring it at a pace that left most of the senior staff slightly breathless. She was brilliant. She was driven. She had an instinct for financial inefficiency that bordered on supernatural. Zest to feed it. She also had a hammer that could fill a room like weather, and she had very little patience for explanations that arrived after something had already gone wrong. Gavin had navigated around that temper carefully. He delivered results. He didn't make excuses. He presented solutions, not problems. He had survived 2 rounds of leadership restructuring that had eliminated a combined 14 senior employees, and he had survived them because he was useful in a way that was hard to articulate and harder to replace. But he was tired. He had been tired for a while, actually, in a way that sleep didn't entirely fix. The emergency meeting was called for 9 o'clock Thursday morning. Cassandra Wren's executive conference room was on the 14th floor, and it had floor-to-ceiling windows that looked out over the city with the kind of view that communicated subtlety, exactly where power lived in this building. The table was long and glass-topped, and the chairs were the kind of chairs that cost more than some people's car payments. Gavin arrived with his folder and his recovery plan and his 4 hours of broken sleep. There were 12 people in the room by 9:05. Cassandra arrived at 9:07, which meant she was 2 minutes late by her own standard, which meant she was already irritated before she sat down. She was wearing a charcoal blazer, and her dark hair was pulled back, and she had the focused, compressed energy of someone who had already decided how she felt about something before she walked through the door. She didn't say good morning. She sat down, opened her laptop, looked at a screen Gavin couldn't see, and said, someone needs to explain to me how we are 4 days away from the Hargrove deadline, and I'm looking at a logistics failure that nobody seems to have anticipated. The room was quiet in the way that rooms get quiet when everybody is waiting for someone else to speak first. Gavin spoke first. He always did. Cassandra, I have a full breakdown of what happened and a recovery plan ready to walk you through. The short version is that storm disruption out of the Gulf hit 3 of our primary supplier routes simultaneously, which is a scenario that was actually flagged in the risk assessment I submitted in February. We've been working through the night, and we have a viable rerouting plan that will... I'm not asking for a presentation, Gavin. I'm asking why this wasn't managed before it became a crisis. Kept his voice level. Some of it was managed. I contacted Hargrove directly last night and got ahead of it with Phil Delaney before it hit their tracking system. He's not in panic mode right now, specifically because I made that call. The rerouting plan we've built uses 2 backup carriers that I've maintained relationships with over the past 3 years for exactly this kind of situation. The situation is recoverable. I'd like 5 minutes to show you. How much is the rerouting going to cost us? He had the number. Approximately 80 to 90,000 above original projections. That comes out of margin on this delivery, but we preserve the $11 million contract and the relationship with Hargrove, which is 80 to 90,000. She said it like she was reading something off a wall. Then she looked around the table. So we have a major contract at risk. We have a logistics failure that apparently nobody saw coming. Actually, the risk assessment, and now we're looking at an additional 6-figure cost to fix it. Preserve the contract, which is worth... I know what the contract is worth. Her voice was sharp now, clipped at the edges. What I want to understand is how a senior project manager on a contract of this size didn't have contingencies in place. Gavin looked at her. He felt something steady and quiet move through him, not anger. Exactly, more like clarity. Contingencies are in the folder in front of me. I'd like to present them. Cassandra looked at him for a beat too long. There were 12 people in the room watching that looked past between them, and not one of them made a sound. She said it. Get it done or get the hell out of my company. 5 words. Room temperature dropped. Gavin didn't flinch. He didn't look around the table to measure anybody's reaction. He looked at Cassandra Wren for a long moment, long enough that it was clearly deliberate, and then he looked down at the folder in front of him. He thought about 7 years. He thought about the February risk assessment that nobody had read. He thought about Roy downstairs making terrible coffee, and Marcus running rerouting calculations at 3 in the morning, and the fact that Phil Delaney at Hargrove trusted him, personally trusted him, a way that had taken years to build and couldn't be transferred by sending a different project manager to take his place. He thought about Lily. He thought about the look on Lily's face 2 weeks ago when he had called to say he couldn't make her school's spring showcase because there was a client call that couldn't be moved. She hadn't cried. She was 10, and she was learning not to cry about those things, which was maybe the saddest part. She had just said, "Okay, Dad," in the particular flat voice that children use when they have decided to stop hoping for something. Closed the folder. He stood up. Nobody said a word. He pushed his chair in. He actually pushed his chair in, neatly, the way you do when you have been raised to leave things the way you found them, and he walked to the door. Gavin, one of the other executives, said his name. He didn't know which one, and he didn't turn around to find out. He walked out. The elevator ride down 14 floors felt both very short and oddly long. He stopped at his office, which was on the 8th floor, took his jacket off the back of his chair, his coffee mug, a dumb novelty mug that Lily had picked out at a gift shop 2 Christmases ago, the kind with a cartoon sloth that said, "I work at my own pace." He stood there looking at it for a moment, wrapped it in a paper towel he pulled from the desk drawer and put it in his bag. Took the picture of Lily off his desk, took his personal hard drive, left everything else. Marcus appeared in the doorway. His face was doing something complicated. "Gavin, you've got the recovery plan," Gavin said. "Everything you need is in the shared folder. Carrier contacts are in there. Phil Delaney's direct line is in there. You can do this." "That's not what I'm asking." "I know." She shouldn't have said that. Gavin looked at him. She shouldn't have. He put his bag on his shoulder. The sloth mug was inside, wrapped in a paper towel. He shook Marcus's hand, actually shook it, firm and clean, like they were 2 people finishing a job, and he walked to the elevator and pressed the button for the lobby. The drive home took 22 minutes. He sat in the driveway for a while before going inside, because he was falling apart. He wasn't, not yet, in any visible way, but because he was trying to decide what to feel first. There was the immediate practical fear. It was a single father with a mortgage payment and a daughter who was going to need braces next year and a truck that needed rear brakes. He had savings, not unlimited savings, savings that would give him time, but not forever. There was also something else underneath the fear. Something quieter, something he hadn't quite had words for in a while. He sat with it. When he went inside, the house was still. Lily was at school. He made himself a sandwich he didn't particularly want, ate it standing over the kitchen sink, and then did something he hadn't done on a weekday in longer than he could remember. He sat on the back porch with a cup of coffee, and he let himself be still for a minute. The neighbor's dog was barking somewhere down the block. There was a cardinal in the oak tree in the backyard. Coffee was decent better than Roy's, honestly, though he would never say that to Roy's face. His phone had already buzzed 11 times. He turned it face down on the porch railing. That afternoon, he was there when Lily came home from school. Came through the back door, the way she always did, dropping her backpack in the kitchen, opening the refrigerator, staring into it with the particular blank focus of a child who isn't actually hungry but doesn't know what else to do. Yes, he poutine. Then she turned around and saw him sitting at the kitchen table with a second cup of coffee and the Tuesday newspaper he'd never gotten around to reading. She stared at him. "Why are you home?" "I left work early." She squinted. This was suspicious. "Are you sick?" "Did something happen?" He looked at her, his daughter, 10 years old, strawberry thief, spring showcase attended alone, and he said, "Yeah, something happened. I'll tell you about it when I figure out how to explain it." She thought about that for a second. Then she said, "Okay. Do we have homework snacks? There are apples. That's not a snack. There's peanut butter. She considered that's barely a snack. I'll order pizza for dinner. That negotiation apparently satisfied her because she grabbed an apple, pointed at him with it in a way that communicated, "We're not done talking about this," and disappeared toward her room. He sat there at the kitchen table in the middle of a Thursday afternoon with nothing on his schedule and the Tuesday, and a cold cup of coffee. He didn't exactly what came next. For the first time in a long time, he had the odd and uncomfortable feeling that the life he'd been carefully building had been, piece by piece, assembled around a job, and that maybe it was time to find out what the rest of it was supposed to look like. Upstairs, Lily was playing music too loud, which was against the house rules, and he didn't call up to tell her to turn it down. He just let her play it. The first 3 days after Gavin walked out, North Star ran on momentum the way a car runs, after you've cut the engine still moving, still feeling like it's going somewhere, coasting on what was already in motion rather than anything new. Cassandra Wren did not spend those 3 days worrying about Gavin Mercer. She spent them managing the fallout from the storm disruption, fielding calls from her CFO about the rerouting costs, and telling herself and anyone who asked that replacing a project manager was a routine HR function that would be handled within the week. She had built a company with over 2,000 employees. She had acquired North Star at 28 years old when most of her peers were still arguing about title bumps and expense account limits. She had restructured an entire logistics division in 11 months. She did not lose sleep over personnel decisions. That was what she told herself. What she didn't tell herself, what she didn't allow herself to examine too closely, was the specific the room had felt after Gavin pushed his chair in and walked out. Particular quality of the silence. The fact that 3 separate executives had looked at her with expressions that were very carefully arranged to look like nothing at all. She posted the position on Thursday afternoon. Senior Project Manager, North Star Freight Solutions. Competitive salary, immediate start preferred. She told her assistant to prioritize it. Then she moved on to the next problem, because there was always a next problem, and that was what she did. Prapence, Marcus Webb held things together for those first 3 days through a combination of competence and the detailed recovery plan that Gavin had left behind, like a roadmap drawn by someone who knew they weren't going to be there to drive. Marcus was good at his job. He followed the plan, made the calls, coordinated with the backup carriers. The Hargrove delivery slipped 38 hours, which was close to what Gavin had projected, and Phil Delaney received it with the measured patience of a man who had been prepared for the news in advance by Gavin. The night before everything fell apart. Part worked. That part Gavin had already saved before he left. It was everything else that started to come apart. The first sign was small enough that nobody flagged it as a sign at all. Client named Brecker Wholesale had a standing weekly check-in that Gavin had been running personally for about 2 years. Because it was formally assigned to him, it had started as a favor when their previous contact left the company, and Gavin had simply kept doing it because Brecker's operations director, a meticulous woman named Sandra Cho, had trust issues with new contacts, and Gavin had been patient enough to earn her confidence over several months of calls. When the check-in didn't happen that first Thursday, Sandra Cho sent an email. The email went to a general project management inbox that nobody owned now that Gavin was gone. It sat there over the weekend. Sandra Cho sent a follow-up on Monday. That one also sat. By Tuesday, she was calling North Star's main client line, and the person who answered didn't know who she was or which account she was referring to, and told her someone would get back to her within 24 hours. Sandra Cho was not a woman who waited 24 hours when she had questions about her supply chain. That same week, a mid-sized contract with a company called Dalton Building Materials started showing signs of strain. Problem wasn't a logistics failure. The deliveries were running fine. The problem was that Dalton's procurement manager, a man named Terry Albright, had been in quiet conversation with Gavin for the past 6 months about potentially expanding the contract for a new construction project in the fall. Those conversations hadn't been documented anywhere official. They existed in emails, in phone calls, in the particular informal trust that develops between two people who have been doing business together long enough to speak frankly. When Terry Albright called North Star to continue those conversations, he was transferred twice and eventually connected to an account coordinator who had no idea the expansion was even being discussed. Terry Albright was not rude about it. He thanked the coordinator and said he'd follow up soon. He did not follow up. What Cassandra knew in those first 2 weeks was what showed up in reports and what people brought to her attention in meetings. What she didn't know, what nobody brought to her in a meeting, because nobody had the full picture, was how much of North Star's operational stability had been maintained through relationships that existed primarily inside one man's head and calendar and phone contact list. Gavin hadn't done this on purpose. He hadn't been hoarding influence or making himself deliberately irreplaceable as some kind of job security strategy. He had simply been the kind of person who remembered things, who followed up, who called when he said he would call, who showed up when he said he would show up. And over 7 years, that consistency had calcified into something that looked, from the outside, like just another employee doing his job, but was in practice something closer to connective tissue. When you remove connective tissue, things don't break all at once. They shift, they loosen, and then one day you reach for something and it isn't there. It was Marcus who first understood how serious it was, and it was Marcus who made the call he'd been dreading for 5 days. He knocked on the frame of Gavin's old office, now empty, still smelling faintly, like the takeout from the all-nighter 2 weeks ago, and then realized there was nobody inside to knock for. He turned around, went back to his desk, and called Gavin's cell. Gavin answered on the third ring. There was background noise that sounded like a hardware store or maybe a home improvement place, the particular ambient echo of high ceilings and cartwheels. "It's Marcus. I know. How are you holding up?" It was such a Gavin. It was such check on someone calling to check on someone else in the middle of what was Gushin's mess that Marcus almost laughed. "Honestly, I'm drowning a little. The Hargrove recovery went fine. You saved that one before you left. But I'm realizing that I don't know half of what you knew about half these accounts. And I don't know who to ask, because I'm not even sure which ones I don't know about." Pause on Gavin's end. Sandra Cho at Brecker. Yeah. She's escalated. She's going to escalate until she talks to someone who can answer a specific question about their fall routing schedule. The answer, by the way, is in a spreadsheet in the shared drive, folder labeled Brecker Q3 Planning. But she doesn't want a spreadsheet. She wants a person. She wants you. She wants someone consistent. It doesn't have to be me. Marcus exhaled. I know that. I also know that right now it's not me because she barely knows who I am and I've got about 14 other fires, Gavin. Are you coming back? Has anyone called you? Pause. HR sent an email, HR. Marcus said it flatly. They sent you an email. Standard stuff. Return of company property. Final paycheck timeline. Nobody from above that. No. Marcus rubbed his face with one hand. He was sitting at his desk with 4 browser tabs open, and a legal pad covered in notes that were starting to look like a foreign language. "Okay," he said. I needed to know where things stood." "Marcus, you've got the plan. Work the plan. You can do this." "I'm not doubting that I can do the job. I'm telling you that pieces are falling that you can't see from the outside," Gavin said. His voice was quiet and clear, and carried none of the bitterness Marcus would have felt in the same position, which somehow made it worse. They are. That was the end of that conversation. Gavin was at a hardware store because the kitchen faucet in his house had developed a slow drip that he'd been meaning to fix for 4 months and had never had time to deal with. He bought a replacement cartridge and some plumber's tape and went home and fixed it himself, which took about 40 minutes and 1 YouTube tutorial and produced a satisfaction that was embarrassingly disproportionate to the actual task. Lily came home from school to find him under the kitchen sink with a flashlight. "Are we broken?" she asked, peering under the cabinet at him. The faucet was dripping. "Fixed it." sat down on the kitchen floor next to the cabinet and watched him work for a minute. "Dad, are you okay?" He finished tightening the fitting, checked it again. "I'm working on figuring that out. Because you fixed the faucet. The faucet needed fixing. You also reorganized the garage yesterday." He slid out from under the sink and sat up, back against the cabinet. Lily was sitting cross-legged, on the tile floor, looking at him with the particular watchful expression she had inherited from someone her mother, maybe, or just from the experience of being a kid who learned early to read the room. She was 10 years old, and sometimes she looked at him like she was 30. "I have a lot of time right now," he said. "That's not a bad thing. Are we going to be okay? Like, money okay?" He looked at her steadily. He had decided a long time ago that he wasn't going to lie to Lily about the things she was genuinely old enough to worry about. "We have savings, and I'm going to find something." "Yes." This is a pause, not a stop. She thought about that. "Okay." She stood up and opened the refrigerator. "Can we have breakfast for dinner?" "I want the strawberry pancakes." 4:30. The pancakes don't know that. He could not argue with that logic. He made strawberry pancakes at 4:30 in the afternoon on Wednesday, and Lily ate 3 of them and stole 2 strawberries from his plate, even though he specifically had extras on the side because she was going to steal them. And that evening he helped her with a book report on a novel she had mostly read, but had gotten distracted near the end, and was now trying to construct a conclusion from context clues and summary websites. He didn't write it for her. He asked her questions until she figured out what she wanted to say. It was a normal evening. It was a profoundly ordinary Wednesday, and he was there for all of it. Meanwhile, at North Star, the 3rd week was where things started showing up in numbers. A report that Marcus compiled not for Cassandra initially, just to track what he was managing, showed 11 client interactions that had gone wrong in the 2 weeks since Gavin's departure. Catastrophically wrong. Not lawsuit wrong. The quiet kind of wrong that doesn't have a line item. Calls that weren't returned fast enough. Questions that got bounced between departments. 2 instances of incorrect information being given to clients because the person answering didn't have the context to know what they didn't know. Sandra Cho at Brecker Wholesale had sent a formal inquiry about account management continuity. The language was polite and precise and carried exactly the amount of warning that a long-term client embeds in polite, precise language when they are telling you something without saying it directly. Terry Albright at Dalton had, according to a junior account coordinator who thought to mention it in a team, been seen having lunch with a representative from a competitor. Whether that was actually related to the account situation or just a lunch, nobody should read into, nobody was sure. That uncertainty was its own kind of problem. And then there was Hargrove. Phil Delaney called North Star's main line and asked to speak with Gavin Mercer. He was told with apologies that Gavin was no longer with the company. Phil Delaney was quiet for a long moment that the call coordinator described later as uncomfortable. Then he asked to speak with whoever had taken over the account. The meeting that followed did not go badly. The account coordinator who took it was prepared and professional. When Phil Delaney asked, point blank, "What happened?" Gavin called me personally before that storm situation went sideways. That's not something I was expecting to lose. The coordinator didn't have a good answer because there wasn't one. Cassandra's standard messaging for departed employees pursuing other opportunities was the kind of non-answer that a 20-year procurement veteran like Phil Delaney saw through immediately. He thanked them for the meeting. He said he'd be in touch. He was not immediately in touch. It was the CFO, a careful and extremely organized woman named Patricia Reeves, who first brought the full picture to Cassandra's desk. Patricia had been at North Star for 4 years, had survived the acquisition and the restructuring, and had a habit of presenting bad news with the calm and thoroughness of a doctor explaining a diagnosis to someone who hasn't asked the right questions yet. She came in on a Tuesday morning with a bound summary actual paper, printed and bound, which meant she wanted it in Cassandra's hands and not on a screen she could close and set it on the desk. "I Want to walk you through something, Patricia said. Cassandra looked at the bound document. What is this? I've been tracking the operational impact since Gavin Mercer left. I'm calling it a preliminary account risk assessment, but that title is doing some heavy lifting. She sat down across from Cassandra without being invited to, which Patricia occasionally did, and which Cassandra had long since stopped correcting because Patricia's instincts about when to wait for permission were generally reliable. The short version is that we have 3 client relationships showing early instability, and 2 of them are accounts where Gavin was the primary relationship contact for years. The third one, Dalton, is more speculative, but the indicators are not good. Cassandra looked at her. Accounts have relationship managers. That's a department. He was the relationship manager on these accounts. Officially, in most cases, but functionally, he maintained contact. He knew the histories. He knew the people. Patricia paused. I want to show you something. She opened the bound report to a specific page and turned it around so Cassandra could read it. This is a list of client-facing actions that Gavin took in the last quarter of the prior fiscal year that were not assigned to him by his job description. Cassandra read the page. It was a long page. She turned to the next one. That one was longer. Some of this is informal, Patricia said. It doesn't appear in official logs because he wasn't required to log it. I found it through email records, call logs, and client communications. He was essentially running a secondary layer of account maintenance that nobody assigned him and nobody tracked because it just happened. Everything it prevented from becoming a problem we never knew about because he handled it before it reached the level where it would show up in a report. Cassandra set the report down. There was a particular quality to the silence that followed, not the boardroom silence from 3 weeks ago, which had been the silence of witnesses, but something more private. Patricia Reeves sat across the desk and waited, because she was good at her job, and her job right now was to let Cassandra sit with what she'd just read. The February risk assessment, Cassandra said. Patricia nodded slowly. He submitted one. I pulled it. The storm disruption scenario was not identical, but close enough that if the recommendations had been implemented, we would have had the backup carrier relationships in place through official channels rather than through his personal contact list. Who received it? Routed through Marcus Webb's former supervisor, who left in the restructuring in September. It doesn't appear to have been escalated, so it went nowhere. Cassandra stood up and walked to the window. The city was doing what it always did, moving in the specific indifferent way that cities move when you're standing still. She had fired Gavin Mercer in that room 3 weeks ago in front of 12 people. She had said 5 words and watched him push his chair in and walk out the door, and she had told herself it was a clean and necessary decision made under pressure. Tricia gave her a moment. Then, there's one more thing. Cassandra didn't turn around. Tell me, Hargrove has requested a meeting. An account check-in. A formal meeting with the board. Phil Delaney and Hargrove's VP of Operations both listed on the request. A brief pause. The request language includes the phrase, evaluating our partnership going forward. Cassandra's jaw tightened. $11 million. Client relationship that was nearly a decade old. Client relationship that Gavin Mercer had personally maintained through 2 ownership transitions and 1 major logistic disruption and a phone call made at midnight in the middle of a storm. When? She said. They asked for the end of this month. She was quiet for another long moment. Outside, a plane crossed the upper edge of the window and disappeared. Get me the full personnel file on Gavin Mercer, she said. Performance reviews, client communications, project logs, everything. Tricia nodded. I'll have it this afternoon. And the February risk assessment. I want the original document. I already pulled it. Patricia stood. It's in the back of the report. She left. Cassandra sat back down at her desk and opened the bound report to the back section and found the February risk assessment, 16 pages, clearly formatted. Authored by Gavin Mercer, submitted to a supervisor who no longer worked at the company. Timestamped 4 months before the storm that near Fort Star, one of its largest contracts. She read it from the beginning. He had identified 3 specific vulnerabilities in Northstar's primary logistics corridors. He had modeled the financial exposure of each. He had recommended 2 specific actions, a backup carrier agreement and a redundancy protocol for Gulf Coast routing that would have cost less than $20,000 to implement and would have made the storm response essentially routine rather than a crisis. She read it slowly, the way you read something when you're looking for a reason to disagree with it, and gradually realizing there isn't one. Then she set it down and sat in her office with the afternoon coming in through the windows and the city moving quietly below, and a week's worth of unread HR responses to a job posting that had so far produced 17 resumes, none of which were in the same category as the man who'd written what she'd just finished reading. She didn't call anyone. She didn't open her laptop. She just sat there for a while, which was not something Cassandra Wren did. She was a person of motion, of action, of the next decision, and the one after that. Sitting still with something uncomfortable was not a skill she had practiced. But there is a particular kind of reckoning that you can't outrun by moving faster. You can outpace it for a while. You can build enough momentum that it can't quite catch you. But it will find you in a quiet room eventually, when it does. And when it does, is not gentle. It does not care how busy you've been. The man she had publicly humiliated in front of 12 witnesses was not the person responsible for her company's crisis. She had been looking at it wrong, or choosing to look at it wrong, which was worse because choosing not to look is its own kind of decision. The first time since she'd walked into that conference room 3 weeks ago, Cassandra Wren allowed herself to sit completely still with a thought she had been outrunning at full speed. She had been wrong. Not strategically wrong, not operationally wrong. She had been wrong about a person. She had stood in her own conference room and humiliated someone who had spent 7 years quietly holding pieces of her company together. She had intervened, and she had done it because she was under pressure, and because her pride did not like the feeling of a problem she hadn't prevented, and because there had been someone standing there with a folder full of solutions, and she had been too angry to hear them. She had fired the wrong person, and now she had a formal board meeting request from her largest freight client, 17 resumes that couldn't fill the hole he left, and a 16-page document from February that proved he had tried to warn her before any of it happened. Outside her window, the city kept moving. Inside her office, for the first time in longer than she would admit, Cassandra Wren did not know exactly what to do next. It was a feeling she had spent a decade making sure she never had to sit with. She sat with it. The thing about unemployment that nobody warns you about, the thing that doesn't make it into the practical conversations about savings accounts and resume formatting and how to answer the gap question in. An interview is the strange texture of the time. Gavin had been busy for so long that he had forgotten what unstructured hours felt like. The first week after he left Northstar, he kept waking up at 6:10, 1 minute before his alarm would have gone off, and lying there in the dark with his body already prepared to move and nowhere specific to move to. He made coffee. He read the paper. He fixed the faucet and reorganized the garage and called his dentist to schedule an appointment he'd been postponing since the previous spring. It was not falling apart. He wanted to be clear about that, at least to himself. He was more managing. He was a person who managed things. It was, in some ways, the central fact of his adult life, the skill he had built everything else around. He managed logistics and client relationships and single parenthood and a truck that needed new brakes, and he would manage this. But there were moments, usually around 9 o'clock at night when Lily was in bed and the house was quiet, when the weight of it settled on him in a way that was harder to organize. He'd given 7 years to Northstar. Not just work years, actual years, the kind that don't come back. Evenings, weekends, a school showcase his daughter had attended alone because there was a client call that couldn't be moved. He had done all of that willingly, because he believed in doing the job right, because it was the job, because that was who he was. And the end of it had been 5 words spoken in a conference room by a woman who hadn't read the February risk assessment and hadn't asked, what was in the folder he was trying to open. He let himself feel that for a while. Not wallow, he didn't have the patience for wallowing, but feel it clearly, the way you have to feel something before you can move past it without dragging it behind you. After 2 weeks, he updated his resume. He was methodical about it, the same way he was methodical about everything. He went through his project history. Quantified what he could quantify, described his responsibilities in language that was accurate without being modest. He had managed contracts worth tens of millions. He had built client relationships that generated measurable revenue. He had, on multiple occasions, averted operational crises that the people above him never found out about because he had handled them before they rose to that level. He sent the first version to Marcus for a gut check, because Marcus had known him professionally for 5 years and would tell him the truth. Marcus called back within an hour. It's good. It's honest. It undersells you. I'm not going to oversell. I'm not saying oversell. I'm saying there's a difference between accurate and complete. The Hargrove account alone, Gavin. You held that relationship together through the acquisition. That's not a line item. That's a story. I don't want to write a story. I want to write a resume. Then at least put the Brecker expansion in there. Was your relationship that generated the contract renewal. Gavin was quiet a moment. Okay, I'll add it. And the carrier network you built. The backup contacts Marcus. I'm just saying. I'll look at it again. He did look at it again. He added 2 specific items that he had initially left out because they felt like taking credit for things that were just part of doing the job. Which was the problem. Marcus had pointed out he had spent so long treating exceptional performance as baseline that he'd forgotten other people would recognize it as exceptional. He sent applications to 6 companies over the following 10 days. He wasn't desperate enough to apply indiscriminately, and he wasn't naive enough to think patience was a plan without money eventually becoming a timeline. He was selective and careful, and he did not call in every favor at once, because he believed in using resources proportionally. Call from Meridian Logistics came on a Thursday morning while Gavin was helping Lily practice her multiplication tables, which she found deeply uninteresting and he found deeply necessary, and which had become their daily after-breakfast argument that wasn't quite an argument, because Lily would eventually do them, and Gavin would make her hot chocolate after, as a reward that both of them wasn't a bribe. He looked at the number which he recognized because he had done his research on every company he applied to, and excused himself to the back porch. Mr. Mercer, this is Jennifer Holt. I'm the VP of Human Resources at Meridian Logistics. I'm calling about your application for the Senior Operations Director position. Ms. Holt, thanks for reaching out. I want to be straightforward with you. We've done some preliminary research on your background, and some of what we found went beyond your resume. We spoke with a few people in the industry who know your work. A brief pause. I'd like to schedule a conversation with our COO this week, if you're available. Gavin was aware of the specific quality of that sentence. HR screening, not a preliminary phone call. A conversation with the COO. I'm available. What does your timeline look like? We're hoping to move quickly. This role has been open 3 months, and the right candidate hasn't materialized. We're wondering if that's because the right candidate wasn't looking until recently. He understood what she was telling him without saying it. I can make myself available this week. Excellent. I'll send over the details this afternoon. He went back inside. Lily had abandoned the multiplication tables and was lying on the kitchen floor with the dog, a medium-sized brown mutt named Biscuit, who had appeared at the back door 2 winters ago during a sleet storm and never technically been invited to stay, but had simply remained in the manner of animals who understand that the right moment of need creates an opening. Lily had her arm over Biscuit's back and was staring at the ceiling. Who was that? She asked. A job. She tilted her head to look at him without lifting it off the floor. A good one? Maybe. We'll see. Are you nervous? He considered this with genuine honesty. A little. Yeah. She seemed to find this reassuring rather than alarming, which told him something about what kind of father she needed him to be, not the kind who pretended things were fine. but the kind who is honest about uncertainty without making it her problem to carry. Do good, she said, with the casual confidence of someone who has not yet learned to hedge. Then she looked back at the ceiling. Can I be done with the tables? Biscuit doesn't think I need to know times 7. Biscuit is wrong, Lily sighed, but she got up. The interview with Meridian's COO, a man named David Park, was not what Gavin had expected. He had prepared for the standard battery. Tell me about a time you managed a difficult client. Describe your approach to operational risk. Where do you see yourself in 5 years? And instead, what he got was a conversation. David Park was 51 years old, and had spent his career in logistics and had a particular habit of leaning back in his chair and asking follow-up questions that went slightly sideways from the expected direction, which Gavin found he appreciated because it required him to actually think rather than access rehearsed answers. Tell me about the February risk assessment, David said, about 40 minutes in. Gavin was quiet for a moment. I'd like to understand how you know about that. Phil Delaney at Hargrove mentioned it. He said you'd submitted a document that, if anyone had read it, would have changed how the storm disruption played out. He seemed frustrated that you were no longer at North Star. Phil's a good client, Gavin said. He deserves better communication than he got in the last few weeks. What was in the assessment? So Gavin told him. He laid it out, the 3 vulnerability points, the financial modeling, the specific recommendations, the cost estimate that was less than $20,000 to implement. He talked about backup carrier relationships he had built on his own time because the company hadn't formalized them. He talked about the storm response and the recovery plan and the fact that they were already executing on it before the emergency meeting where everything came apart. David Park listened without interrupting. When Gavin finished, David said, "Why didn't you push harder to get the recommendations implemented?" It was the question Gavin had asked himself in the quiet of his own kitchen more than once. I submitted through the appropriate channel. When it didn't get a response, I followed up once with Marcus's supervisor. When that went nowhere, he paused. I should have escalated more aggressively. I knew the risk, and I let the process tell me it had been handled. That's an honest answer. It's the true one. David was quiet a moment. The position we're filling is Senior Operations Director. That's a step up from project management. It includes direct authority over our Central Corridor division, which has been underperforming for about 8 months. You'd have full hiring and vendor authority within the division budget. You'd report directly to me. He tilted his chair back. What would you want to know before saying yes or no? Gavin thought about the question carefully. What does your leadership culture look like when something goes wrong? David raised an eyebrow, slightly. Meaning? Meaning when there's a crisis, a delivery failure, a client problem, a supply chain disruption. What does that conversation look like with the people above you? Are you looking for someone to blame or someone to fix? A pause. David studied him. Both of those things sometimes feel like the same thing in the moment. David said, "They're not." He looked at Gavin for a beat. Fair question. Here's a fair answer. We have a leadership team that has its tensions and its blind spots like every company does. What I can tell you is that I have been here 9 years, and I have never once been asked to fire someone as a way of managing optics. Does that answer what you were actually asking? Mostly, Gavin said. David almost smiled. The other thing you're probably wondering about is flexibility. You have a daughter. Gavin didn't ask how he knew. It was on his LinkedIn, or it came through in the industry conversation. It didn't matter. She's 10. I've been present for less of her life than I should have been. What would you need? I need to be able to leave at a predictable time 3 days a week. I need to be able to take calls from her school without someone counting it against me. I need it to be understood that I'll do the work. I'll always do the work, but I'm not going to perform availability as a substitute for actual performance. David nodded. Didn't write it down, just nodded the way someone nods when they've already made up their mind about something. I can work with that. I want someone who has thought about how they work, not just how much they work. He stood up, which meant the conversation was over, and extended his hand. We'll have an offer to you by end of week. The offer came on Friday morning. Gavin read it twice, sent it to a lawyer, friend he trusted, for a quick read on the contract language, and called his mother in the evening to tell her. She cried a little, which embarrassed her and didn't embarrass him, and then told him she'd known he'd land on his feet, which was the kind of thing mothers say, and which was not the same as actually knowing, but was still nice to hear. He accepted the following Monday. He told Lily over the breakfast pancakes, not strawberry this time, just regular with butter and maple syrup, and she received the news with the pragmatic satisfaction of a child who had been told there was a plan and had chosen to trust it. Is it a good company, she asked. I think so. Are they nice to you? He considered. The person who interviewed me was honest with me. That's what I'd want. She ate a piece of pancake. Because you deserve that. Good. He looked at his daughter across the breakfast table and didn't say anything for a moment, because sometimes the thing to do is just let a thing land. You've got syrup on your chin, he said. She wiped it with her sleeve. He handed her a napkin. The first month at Meridian was not easy in the way that new job particular exhaustion of learning where everything is and how everything works, and who to trust and what the unspoken rules are, all while being expected to perform at a level that justifies why they hired you. The Central Corridor division that Gavin had inherited was underperforming in ways that were partially structural and partially cultural. And the cultural piece was the harder one, because it had developed over time out of a specific kind of low-grade demoralization that sets in when a team has been managed by someone who didn't trust them. His predecessor, he gathered from careful listening and the occasional unguarded comment, had been a micromanager in the specific style that removes all ownership from the people doing the work and then blames them for the results. Team was competent and exhausted and had collectively developed the habit of waiting to be told what to do rather than deciding anything, because deciding things had historically led to being told they'd decided wrong. Gavin recognized this because he had watched it happen to other teams at North Star and had never been in a position to do anything about it. He was in a position to do something about it now. He spent the first 2 weeks mostly listening. He had one-on-one meetings with every person on his team, not performances, reviews, just conversations. He asked them what was working and what wasn't. He asked them what decisions they felt like they should be able to make, but couldn't. They were afraid to tell him, which was an uncomfortable question that produced useful answers. One logistics coordinator named Beth, who had been at Meridian for 6 years, told him in her one-on-one that she had a solution to a recurring routing inefficiency in the eastern part of the corridor that she'd been sitting on for 5 months, because every time she brought up ideas in team meetings, her previous manager would. And then nothing would happen, and eventually she'd learn to stop. Show me, Gavin said. She pulled up the spreadsheet she'd built on her own time and walked him through it. It wasn't perfect. There were 2 variables she hadn't accounted for, and one assumption that needed adjustment, but the core of the idea was sound, and when they worked through the numbers together, corrected model showed a potential efficiency improvement of about 11% on those routes. That's real, Gavin said. That's a real thing. Let's pilot it. Beth looked at him, the way people look at someone when they're not quite sure they heard correctly. You want to run the pilot? I want you to run the pilot. Put together a proposal, what you need, what the timeline looks like, what you'll measure. Bring it to the team meeting Thursday. She brought it to the team meeting Thursday. She was nervous about it in a way that was visible, and that the team noticed because they all understood the specific risk of being the person who speaks up. Gavin let her present the full thing without interrupting, asked 2 genuine questions, and then asked the rest of the team what they thought. The conversation that followed was the first real team conversation he'd witnessed since joining people pushing back on each other's points. Someone identifying a problem that Beth hadn't considered, someone else immediately suggesting a fix. It was messy and went 6 minutes over the scheduled time and ended with a workable plan. After the meeting, a man on his team named Julio, who had said almost nothing in any of the one-on-ones and who Gavin had been quietly watching, stopped him in the hallway. It was different, Julio said. Different from what? Julio looked at him. From before. People don't usually push back like that. Why not? Because it usually doesn't go anywhere. Gavin nodded. It went somewhere today. Julio thought about that. He said, it did. That was not a transformation. Gavin was not under the illusion that 2 weeks of different behavior undoes years of accumulated caution. Trust is slow, and it is built in accumulated small things, the way anything durable is built not in one gesture, but in the pattern of gestures that follows. He knew that. He was patient about it, in the way he was patient about most things that mattered. Not passively patient, actively patient, which means you keep showing up and doing the same thing consistently, even when it's not producing visible results yet. Because you understand that visible results come after the invisible work is already done. Back at North Star, the visible results of Gavin's absence were becoming harder to manage. The Hargrove board meeting had happened, and it had not gone well in the specific way that meetings go badly when the questions being asked don't have good answers. Phil Delaney and Hargrove's VP of Operations had sat across from Cassandra's board and asked with studied professionalism what North Star's plan was for restoring the operational consistency that the account had historically relied on. What they were actually asking, what everyone in the room understood they were asking, was why the trust was gone and who was going to be held accountable for the last 6 weeks of degraded service. Cassandra had answered the question she could answer. She had presented the recovery plan, the new account management structure, the service guarantee commitments. She had been composed and clear and had not made excuses. But she had felt something in that room that she was not used to feeling in business situations. She had felt that she was behind something, behind the 8 ball, behind the moment, behind the trust that Phil Delaney had built with a man she'd publicly fired, and that there was no presentation or strategic response that was going to fully close that gap. Some things once lost don't respond to strategy. They respond only to time, and only if you're very lucky and very honest, and the person you lost them with decides to give you the chance. Hargrove did not pull the contract after the meeting, but they reduced their commitment for the following quarter by 30%, framing it as a routine portfolio adjustment in language that didn't fool anyone in the room. 30% of an $11 million contract was a number that showed up very clearly on the quarterly projections. And when it showed up next to 3 other accounts that were showing similar, if smaller, signs of strain. Patricia Reeves had a follow-up meeting with Cassandra after the numbers were in. She sat across the desk again, without the bound report. This time they were past the point of needing to document the problem, because the problem was now documenting itself in the financial statements. What's the total projected impact? Cassandra asked. Conservative estimate, Q3 and Q4 combined, somewhere between 2 and 3 million in reduced revenue, with the Hargrove reduction being the largest single piece. There are also indirect costs, the rerouting expense, increased account management hours to stabilize the other accounts. Good. Patricia paused. We lost one. Cassandra looked up from the numbers. Which one? Brecker Wholesale. Sandra Cho sent formal notice this morning. They're moving to a competitor, effective end of quarter. The room was quiet. Brecker wasn't North Star's largest account, but it was one they'd held for 11 years, which was 3 years longer than Cassandra had owned the company. It was an account that had survived the acquisition, survived the restructuring, survived everything, because Gavin Mercer had returned Sandra Cho's calls and known her fall routing schedule and maintained something that couldn't be rebuilt by reassigning the account to someone new. Have we lost Dalton? Cassandra asked. Not yet, but the signals are not improving. Patricia folded her hands on the desk. The 17 resumes HR had for the project manager position, we've interviewed 6. Of them are at Gavin's level. The 2 strongest candidates both have offers from other companies already. Cassandra was quiet for a long time. I want to know where he landed, she said finally. Patricia, who already knew, kept her voice neutral. Meridian Logistics. He accepted a senior operations director position about 3 weeks ago. Senior Operations Director, a title above what he'd held at North Star. She had expected it. She would have been surprised by anything less, but hearing it stated plainly produced a specific sensation she didn't immediately have a name for. Jealousy, not quite regret. Something closer to the feeling of watching a consequence arrive that you had been given every opportunity to avoid. How is the division performing? Early data, but the indicators are they're moving in the right direction. Of course they were. Cassandra stood up and walked back to the window. The city, the specific indifferent motion of the city that had been there every time she stood at this window in the last month, holding whatever she happened to be holding. She was 30 years old, and she had built something real from real effort and real intelligence, and she was standing in it right now, watching it lose ground in ways that were slow and quiet and relentless, and she understood completely, and without the comfort of self-deception, exactly how she had gotten here. He intervened. She had punished the person who was trying to protect her company because his protection had not been enough to prevent her from feeling the weight of something going wrong, and she had needed somewhere to put that weight, and he had been standing there. It was not a complicated failure. That was the part that was hardest to sit with. It wasn't a strategic error or a structural problem or a market force outside her control. It was a moment in a conference room where she had chosen the release valve of blame over the harder work of listening. The person she had chosen it at the expense of had been the wrong person, and had known it at some level, even as it was happening, and she had done it anyway, because she was under her pressure and her pride was uncomfortable, and she was 30 years old, and sometimes 30-year-old billionaires make the same mistakes as everyone else. She didn't say any of that to Patricia. What she said was, "Get me the investigation report. Full one. I want every email, every client statement, every internal communication from the last 6 months that touches the storm disruption and the account instability. I want to see it all. I can have it compiled by end of week." End of week, Cassandra said. Yes, Patricia left. The investigation report came on Friday afternoon, and Cassandra read it over the weekend, alone, seated in her apartment, with the kind of sustained attention she usually reserved for acquisitions and restructuring plans. Jubal. She read it the way you read something when you already know what it's going to say, and you're reading it anyway, because you need to know it completely before you can do the next thing. It was thorough. It was specific. It was in the particular way of documents that simply compile facts without editorializings, devastating. The emails from Gavin, years of them flagging risks, proposing solutions, following up on recommendations that went unanswered. Client statements from Phil Delaney, from Sandra Cho's formal notice letter, from Terry Albright's quiet withdrawal from expansion discussions. The internal testimony from Marcus, from Roy, from the junior coordinators who had watched Gavin work through the storm night and had seen what the plan actually contained before it was dismissed unread, and threaded through all of it invisible until you were looking for it. The shape of what Gavin had actually been at North Star, not a project manager, a line item in an org chart, but a person who had spent 7 years making himself into the kind of professional that companies like North Star run and rarely notice until they're gone. When she finished reading, it was past midnight. She set the report on her coffee table and sat in the specific silence of someone who has just run out of ways to argue with themselves. She had been wrong about a person, not wrong in the distant, abstract way that you can manage from inside the comfort of your own narrative. Wrong in the specific, documented, time-stamped way that leaves no room for revision. For a long time she sat with it, seated in her apartment, in the dark, with the city moving quietly outside. Then she picked up her phone and pulled up a contact she had not called before. She didn't press call yet. She sat there with the phone in her hand, his name on the screen. She had something to say to him, and she needed it to be real before she said it. Performed. Strategic. The business version of an apology that is actually an offer. She needed to know what she actually meant before she opened her mouth. Because the one thing she understood with complete clarity at this moment was that Gavin Mercer would know the difference immediately. She sat in the dark with the city outside and her phone in her hand and the investigation report on her coffee table. And she worked on knowing what she actually meant. Took a while. She waited until Monday morning. Not because Monday was strategically better than Sunday night. She understood that the timing of a call like this didn't carry the weight she might once have assigned it, but because she had promised herself she would sleep on it. And she had slept on it, not badly, in the fragmented way you sleep, when something is working itself out in the back of your mind, whether you invite it to or not. She woke at 5:40, with the investigation report still on her coffee table, and the city just beginning to lighten outside her windows. He'd intervened and she lay there for a while, looking at the ceiling and making sure that what she had decided in the dark the night before still held in the early morning. It held. She called at 8:15, which was late enough not to be aggressive, but early enough to communicate that this wasn't an afterthought. She had thought about what she was going to say. Not scripted, she had learned enough about Gavin Mercer in the last 6 weeks to know that scripted would land wrong, but clear. She had decided what she meant, and she was going to say what she meant. And if that wasn't enough, yes, it wasn't enough, and she would deal with that outcome. The phone rang 4 times. She was preparing for voicemail when he answered. Cassandra, not a question. He'd seen the number. Gavin. She paused just briefly enough to signal that this wasn't a routine call. I'd like to meet with you. In person, if you're willing. At North Star. Somewhere neutral, wherever you'd be comfortable. Pause on his end, considering. What's this about? I think you know what it's about. I'd like to hear you say it. She hadn't expected that, and then immediately recognized that she should have. I owe you an apology. A real one, not a phone call. I want to say it to your face. The silence that followed was long enough that she was aware of her own breathing. Then he said, I can do Thursday. Lunch. There's a place called Carver's on Halsted. Do you know it? I'll find it. Noon. Noon, she said. I'll be there. He hung up without any of the social cushioning people usually add to the end of difficult phone calls. No, see you then. Or, sounds good, or any of the small verbal gestures that smooth over the awkward geometry of a conversation like that one. She held the phone for a moment after the line went dead, then set it on the counter and went to make coffee and thought about the fact that in 7 years of having Gavin Mercer at North Star, she had probably never once called him to say she was wrong about something. She had called him to fix things. She had called him when clients were unhappy. She had, in the last weeks of his tenure, publicly told him to produce results or leave. She had never called him for the specific purpose of acknowledging that she had made a mistake at his expense. That fact sat with her over the coffee, uncomfortable and clear. Carver's on Halsted turned out to be the kind of restaurant that didn't try very hard to look like anything other than what it was, a neighborhood lunch place, with dark wood booths and a daily special written on a chalkboard, and the smell of something braised drifting out of the kitchen. It was exactly the kind of place you'd never see inside a business magazine profile of a 30-year-old billionaire CEO, which was probably the point. Gavin was already there when she arrived, 3 minutes before noon, which she had deliberately aimed for. He was in a corner booth, not the one nearest the door, which meant he had arrived early enough to choose. He had coffee. He was reading something on his phone that he put away when she walked in. He looked different from the last time she'd seen him across a conference room table. Physically, he was the same man, same build, same unremarkable face that somehow managed to communicate a great deal when you were paying attention. But there was something settled about him that hadn't been there before, or that she hadn't noticed before, which might be the same thing. He was not a man who appeared to be bracing for something. He was a man who had already decided how fit felt about being here and was simply waiting to proceed. She sat down across from him. A server appeared immediately, the way servers appear in neighborhood lunch places where the staff actually watches the room, and Cassandra ordered water and coffee without looking at the menu. They looked at each other. You look like you've been sleeping, he said. It wasn't a compliment exactly, more an observation. I haven't been sleeping particularly well. I know the feeling. Mine was mostly the first 2 weeks. She registered that the confirmation that it had been hard for him, that walking out hadn't been clean or easy, even if he'd done it with his chair pushed in and his composure intact. How's Meridian? Good. Genuinely good. He said it without performance. Team I inherited needed someone to trust them. That turns out to be easier to fix than I expected. And Lily, something shifted in his face, not a lot, a small and real thing. She's good. She's at school every morning when I drop her off, and she's home every afternoon when I get back. We've done 3 school events in 6 weeks. She stole my strawberries this weekend and didn't apologize for it. Cassandra stopped. That sounds like what it should have been. Yeah, Gavin said quietly. It does. The coffee arrived. She wrapped her hands around the mug and looked at him directly, because she had decided she was going to do this directly, or not do it at all. I read the full investigation report this weekend. All of it. Emails, the client statements, Patricia's account analysis, the February risk assessment. She paused. I want to say what I should have said the moment I finished reading it, which is that I was wrong. Not partially wrong, not wrong in a complicated way that has context and nuance. I was wrong about what happened. I was wrong about you, and I handled it in the worst possible way publicly, in a room full of people who respected you and who watched me do it. Gavin was quiet. He was looking at her steadily, not making it easier by nodding along or giving her anything to push against. Just listening. No. I was under pressure, she continued, and I needed somewhere to put it. And you were standing there with a folder I wasn't willing to open, because opening it would have required me to slow down in a moment when slowing down felt like failure. That's not an excuse. That's an explanation of a failure I own completely. She stopped. You spent 7 years at my company doing work that I didn't see and didn't look for, and the first time something went visibly wrong, I treated you like you were responsible for all of it, without asking a single real question. She held his eyes. I'm sorry, Gavin. I mean that without any other agenda attached to it. He was quiet for a moment. Outside the restaurant, Halsted Street was moving in the particular midday way of city streets, cabs and delivery vans, and people walking with specific urgency toward specific places. Inside, the lunch crowd was filling in around them, low conversations, and the clink of silverware and the chalkboard special, which appeared to be braised short rib. I appreciate you saying that, Gavin said. I mean that. It's not nothing. But? There's no but. I'm not holding on to it. He looked down at his coffee for a beat, then back up. I was angry for a while. I'd be lying if I said I wasn't. 7 years is a long time, and I'd given a lot of it in ways I wasn't always honest with myself about. It's easier to tell yourself you're sacrificing for the job when the job is working. When it ends the way it ended, he paused. But I've had time to look at my part in it too. I let myself become someone whose entire professional life was propping up a system that wasn't giving me what I was putting in. And I kept doing it because I was good at it and because I didn't look up long enough to ask whether good at it was sufficient. Cassandra looked at him. You're being generous. I'm being accurate. He said it without heat. I'm not absolving you. What you said in that conference room was wrong, and you knew it was wrong while you were saying it. But I've thought a lot about what I was doing at North Star and why, and some of those answers are uncomfortable, and they belong to me, not to you. She hadn't expected this either. She had expected she wasn't sure what she had expected. Bitterness, because he hadn't seemed bitter, even at the worst of it. But she had expected a cleaner version of wronged, kind of grievance that has clear edges and sits in one place. This was something messier and more honest, and it was harder to respond to, because it didn't give her anything to argue with or reassure him about. It just sat between them, real and slightly uncomfortable, the way real things tend to sit. There's something else I need to say, Cassandra said. And I want you to know that the apology is not contingent on this. The apology stands regardless of how this goes. Gavin nodded once. Waiting, I want to offer you a position, not your old position. She watched his face. Executive VP of Operations, reporting directly to me. full authority over the operations division, including hiring, vendor contracts, and budget decisions within a defined ceiling. Significant salary increase. I'll give you the number and you can tell me if it's serious. Direct access to my office and to board-level conversations when operations strategy is on the table. She paused. Yes, he'd intervened. The ability to rebuild the department the way you'd have built it if anyone had been listening when you submitted that risk assessment in February. The restaurant moved around them. Someone's phone rang and was quickly silenced. The server refilled her water without being asked. Gavin looked at her for a long moment. He looked at her the way he'd looked at her in the conference room with the specific quality of attention that makes you feel like the person across from you is actually reading what you're saying and not just processing the surface of it. That's a serious offer, he said. It's meant to be. I believe you. He picked up his coffee mug, put it down again. The salary, what's the number? She told him. He didn't react visibly, which told her it had landed where she intended it to. It was more than she'd paid any non-C-suite employee. It was the number she had arrived at by taking what she thought would be impressive, and then adding 30%. Yet he intervened, because she had learned something in the last 6 weeks about the gap between what she'd thought she was paying for and what she had actually been getting. That's real, he said. Yes. He was quiet for a moment. Then he said, Can I ask you something? Of course. If I'd stayed, if I hadn't walked out that morning, if I'd just absorbed it and kept my head down and kept doing the work, what would have been different? She understood the question. It wasn't rhetorical and it wasn't a trap. He was asking something specific and he deserved a specific answer. She thought about it honestly, which took longer than she wished it did. I don't know, she said finally. I want to say I would have seen it eventually, the risk assessment, the client relationships. What you were actually doing. Maybe I would have. She looked at him. But I think the honest answer is that the systems I set in place were very good at telling me what was going wrong and very poor at showing me what was being quietly held together. You would have kept holding it together, and I would have kept not seeing it until something broke again. The next time something broke, I might have done the same thing. Cost her something to say that. He could see it did. I appreciate the honest answer, he said. It's the only kind that's worth giving you. He nodded. He looked out the window at Halsted Street for a moment, and she let him look. The server came, and they ordered she got the short rib because it smelled too good to ignore, and he got something off the regular menu without consulting it, which meant he'd been here before and already knew what he wanted. When the server left, he turned back to face her. I'm going to say no, he said. She'd known it was not possible. She had known it coming in. She had made the offer because it was the right offer to make, and because some part of her, the part that had been sitting in her apartment at midnight with the investigation report and the particular reckoning that doesn't let you negotiate yourself out of it, needed to make it regardless of the answer. Okay, she said, it's not about the mutton. I want to be clear about that, because I think you've put real thought into the number and I don't want to dismiss that. Then what is it about? He thought about how to say it. As he'd intervened, I've spent the last 6 weeks learning what it feels like to build something from the right foundation. Team I inherited at Meridian, they were beaten down, and they'd stopped trusting their own judgment. I'm watching them come back from that. Beth, she's a logistics coordinator. She'd been sitting on a routing improvement for 5 months because she'd learned that bringing ideas forward was pointless. We're running her pilot now and it's working. Julio, who barely said a word in the first 2 weeks, is leading the team meeting this Thursday. He paused. I'm in the early part of that. I can't walk away from it. Because I'm not allowed to. But because walking away from it right now would be doing to them what was done to me. Leaving before the thing gets finished. Cassandra looked at him. That's a very Gavin Mercer reason to say no to a significant offer. Something almost like a smile. It's the true one, though. It is, she said. And she meant it. They ate lunch. The short rib was very good, and she told him so. He told her the coffee He told the coffee at Carver's was better than anywhere within 6 blocks of North Star headquarters, which she filed away as the kind of local knowledge she wouldn't have had any way to acquire from the 14th floor. They talked, as they ate, about North Star not in the specific excavating way of the earlier conversation, but practically. She told him about Hargrove, about the reduced commitment, about Brecker walking. She told him about the 17 resumes and the 6 interviews and the gap that was visible now in ways it hadn't been when he was filling it. He listened. He didn't say, "I told you so," which she appreciated more than she expected to. "What would you do?" she asked at one point. "With the division, if you were trying to fix it." He looked at her. "You want my honest answer?" "I asked for it. The division isn't your core problem. Your core problem is that you don't have a system for hearing things that don't make it into official reports."
Yes.
The risk assessment went through the right channels and disappeared. Sandra Chu's email sat in a general inbox over a weekend. The Dalton expansion conversations existed entirely in informal relationships with no backup. You're running a company where the early warning system is the people, and you have no mechanism for the people's warnings to actually reach the decision level before they become crises. Cassandra was quiet. That's accurate. Build that mechanism. Formal channels for flagging risks directly to senior leadership, without the signal having to survive 3 layers of management. Make it someone's specific job to read what gets submitted and respond with something other than silence. He picked up his fork. The investigation report, you read the reason it had to be compiled by Patricia after the fact is because nothing in your existing structure would have surfaced it proactively. Fix that structure, and you'll catch the next person before they leave. She made a mental note. Not a memo, note an actual internal note, the kind that goes into the layer of thinking that informs decisions rather than the layer that produces documents. "You're consulting for me for free right now," she said. "Consider it severance." That surprised a genuine laugh out of her, short, real, slightly startled. The first time she had laughed in a week, probably. He smiled at that. A real one which was different from the almost smile from earlier. "You should call Marcus," he said. "He's good. He's been doing more than his job for the last 6 weeks without a title or compensation to match it. If you're looking for someone who understands the accounts and the clients and has been holding things together through the worst of it, he's your person. Give him the room and pay him what he deserves and stop before he follows me out the door." "Is that likely?" "He's loyal. But loyalty has a weight limit." Gavin looked at her steadily. "He hit me up once, a few weeks in, and he sounded like a man who had realized he was holding something too heavy alone. Let it go past that." She nodded. "I'll call him this week." Call him, meet with him, in person, with a real number and a real title change ready to put on the table. Make him ask for it. She looked at him for a moment. "You're still managing things. Old habit." "No," she said. "It's not a habit. It's who you are." She said it without flattery, just as an observation, the kind you make when you've finally seen something clearly after looking at it wrong for a long time. "You were doing it at North Star, and I didn't see it because it didn't look like what I thought results were supposed to look like. Results that prevent problems don't look like results. They look like nothing happening." She paused. "I understand that now." He looked at her. "For what it's worth, I think you'll run it better. After this, I genuinely believe that. That's more generous than I've earned. But I've read enough about you to know that when you decide to fix something, you actually fix it. You're not someone who makes a structural error twice." He picked up his coffee. "The question is whether you're willing to be uncomfortable long enough to make the changes that actually matter versus the ones that look like change. What's the difference? The difference is whether you fire one executive and call it culture reform, or whether you actually ask the people in your building what they're afraid to tell you, and then sit there while they say it. He held the mug. "The second one is harder. It requires you to hear things that are going to make you feel bad about decisions you've already made. Most people in your position prefer the first one because it's cleaner and produces better press. I'm not interested in press right now." "I know," he said. "That's why I'm telling you." They finished lunch. The server cleared the plates and left the check, and Cassandra reached for it automatically, which was a reflex. Gavin looked at it. "Let me get it," he said. She looked at him. "Gavin, I asked you to meet me here. I picked the place." He picked up the check. "Also, I can afford it now." There was something dry and understated in his delivery that made it land as a statement of fact rather than a joke, though it was both. She let him take it. Outside on Halsted Street, the early afternoon had that particular quality of city fall not cold enough to demand a coat, but cool enough that you felt glad you'd brought one. They stood on the sidewalk for a moment in the slightly awkward awe of a conversation that has concluded, but hasn't quite ended yet. "I'm glad you called," Gavin said. "I want you to know that. I'm glad you came. I almost didn't," he said matter-of-factly. "I sat with it for a day and a half before I agreed to meet." "What made you decide yes?" He thought about it. "Lily asked me what I was going to do, and I told her someone wanted to meet and apologize, and I was deciding whether to go. And she asked me, is it easier to be angry or to let it go? And I told her that was a complicated question. And she said, no, it isn't." He paused. "She's 10 years old and she's usually right." Cassandra looked at him on the sidewalk, with the city moving behind him, and the afternoon light coming in low. "She sounds like someone worth reorganizing a life around." "She is," he said, simply, without excess. "The way you say something when you mean it, without needing it to be more than it is." They shook hands, which was slightly formal and slightly right, the gesture of two people who are not enemies and are not quite whatever comes after that, but who have concluded something real between them and want the ending to be clean. His handshake was the same as it had been the last time he'd done it, in the hallway outside his office. Marcus watching, pinched. On the morning, everything changed. Firm and clean, like a person who finishes what he starts. He walked in one direction. She walked in the other. She got half a block before she stopped and turned around, though he was already gone. She stood on the sidewalk for a moment in the afternoon light, thinking about what he'd said, about the early warning system, Marcus, about the difference between changes that look like reform and changes that actually require something of you. She pulled out her phone and called Patricia Reeves. "Marcus Webb," she said when Patricia answered. "What's his current title and compensation?" Brief pause while Patricia, who always had this information immediately available, because she was Patricia, accessed it. She gave the title. She gave the number. "Set up a meeting," Cassandra said. "This week, my office. Tell him it's about his role going forward, not about the accounts." She paused. "And Patricia, pull the risk assessment submission protocols. I want to know exactly what happens to a document after it's submitted and before it reaches senior leadership. Every step, every filter, every place a February risk assessment can go to disappear. I can have that by tomorrow. Today, if you can manage it." "I'll try." She hung up and stood another moment on the sidewalk. Cab went by. A woman pushing a stroller negotiated a gap in the parked cars. Somewhere down the block, someone was loading a truck, and the metal ramp made that particular reverberant clang that carries in city air. She thought about what Gavin had said, that when she decided to fix something, she actually fixed it. She thought about whether that was still true. Whether the version of herself that had walked into a conference room 6 weeks ago and fired the wrong person for the wrong reasons had done something to the thing that was still fixable. She thought she had. She thought it was still intact, the capacity to be honest with herself, long enough to change something that needed changing, the willingness to hear what was uncomfortable, stubbornness that could be either her best quality or her worst, depending entirely on what it was pointed at. It had been pointed at the wrong things. She started walking again. Behind her, Carver's on Halsted was still doing its noon business, a little neighborhood restaurant that a 30-year-old billionaire CEO would never have found on her own, on a street she'd never had reason to be on. At a table where a man she had publicly fired had just spent an hour being more honest with than most people in her life had been in years. She thought about Lily, 10 years old, and apparently in possession of a clearer view of things than most adults Cassandra knew. Is it easier to be angry or to let it go? And no, it isn't. She thought about the February risk assessment. 16 pages. Submitted correctly. Disappeared into a chain of management that no longer existed. She thought about Beth and the routing efficiency pilot that was apparently working. She thought about what it would mean to actually build a company where that kind of thing, a logistics coordinator, holding a solution for 5 months because no one was listening, couldn't happen. As a policy, not as a press release, as an actual structural reality. She had built North Star once from the outside. She had to build it from the inside, which was harder, because it required her to look at the parts of herself that had produced the failures. Those parts were not separate from the parts that had produced the successes. They were the same material. The drive and the impatience were related. The decisiveness and the dismissiveness were related. You couldn't keep the version that had made her 30 years old and successful, and simply excise the version that had stood in a conference room and said 5 words that cost her everything she'd spent 2 years building in the people around her. You had to learn to tell them apart in the moment. Before the words came out, before the folder stayed closed, before the room went silent and a man pushed his chair in and walked out the door. That was the work, not the restructuring, not the investigation, not the offer she'd made over short ribs at a corner booth on Halstead. The actual work was the internal kind, the kind nobody could document or compile into a report, kind that happens in quiet moments when there is pressure and there is a person standing in front of you with a folder and you have to decide in real time whether you are going to be the leader you tell yourself you are or the one you were 6 weeks ago. She had failed that test once. She intended to pass it the next time. 3 blocks from her car, she called Marcus Webb's direct line. His email, his phone. He answered on the second ring, slightly wary. Cassandra, Marcus, I'm sorry for calling your direct line. Do you have 5 minutes? Pause. Yeah, I've got 5 minutes. I want to meet this week. My office, or somewhere else if you'd prefer. I want to talk about what you've been carrying since Gavin left and about what your role at North Star looks like going forward. As a crisis conversation, as an overdue one. Another pause. Longer. She could hear him deciding whether this was what it sounded like, or something else. Okay, he said finally. Thursday morning works for me. Thursday morning, she said. I'll have my assistant send the details. And Marcus, bring whatever you've been tracking. The account status, the risk flags, whatever you've been managing. That wasn't in your job description. I want to see all of it. A beat. Gavin talked to you? We had lunch. He said no to coming back, didn't he? She didn't confirm it. Thursday morning, she repeated. I'll see you then. She ended the call, kept walking. The afternoon was thinning into the long gold light of early fall, and the city was making the shift from midday to late afternoon in the particular way it does a gear, change you can feel without quite being able to point to the moment it happened. She had a board call in 2 hours, and a vendor contract review after that, and a full day tomorrow that was already overbooked in the specific way that every day was overbooked when you were running a company in the middle of losing ground. Of that had changed. The ground that had been lost was still lost. Brecker was still gone. Hargrove was still running at 70%. The division Gavin would have rebuilt was still waiting for someone to rebuild it. But she was walking differently than she had been walking into Carver's 3 hours ago. Fixed, not resolved. Just differently, with the particular quality of forward motion that comes not from certainty, but from clarity, from knowing exactly what went wrong and what it cost and what it would require to do differently, and deciding to do it anyway. Was enough for today. She had a board call in 2 hours. Kept walking. The Thursday morning meeting between Cassandra and Marcus lasted 2 hours and 40 minutes, which was an hour longer than either of them had scheduled for it. Marcus came prepared, the way Gavin had taught him to come prepared with documents, with numbers, yes, with a clear account of what had happened to each at-risk client relationship in the 6 weeks since the departure, and with the particular organized calm of someone who has been carrying too much for too long and has decided that today is the day he puts it on the table and sees what happens. He brought the account tracking sheet he'd built on his own time. He brought a risk log that nobody had asked him to maintain. He brought the email chain from Sandra Cho's escalation, the one that had sat in the general inbox over a weekend, with a note at the top that said simply, "This is the kind of thing that needs a person attached to it." Cassandra read everything he put in front of her before she said anything. She didn't rush it. She didn't skim. She read it the way Gavin had once tried to show her a recovery plan in a conference room, the way that situation should have gone, with actual attention, with the willingness to be informed before she responded. When she looked up, Marcus was watching her with the carefully neutral expression of someone who has decided to wait and see. "You've been doing this since day one," she said. It wasn't a question. That's not an answer. He looked at her. "Yes, since day one. Why didn't you escalate the Sandra Cho situation when it started?" "I did. I flagged it to the account management director. It went into a queue." He paused. The queue had 23 items in it. The director was managing the Hargrove situation and 2 other fires simultaneously. Sandra Cho's emails were polite and didn't read as urgent unless you knew her communication style, and the only person who knew her communication style had just left the building. Cassandra was quiet for a moment. What would you have needed? To catch it in time? Marcus thought about it. Not performing thinking, actually thinking. Authority to escalate client risk flags directly to VP level without going through the queue. And someone at VP level whose actual job it is to read them before they become a fire. He paused. Gavin used to do that informally. He'd flag things to me. I'd flag them to him. We'd decide together what level of alarm it warranted. It worked because we trusted each other's read on it. But it was invisible to the structure. When he left, the informal system left with him. She nodded slowly. Then she told him what she'd decided. Title change, VP of Client Operations, and the compensation number she'd worked out with Patricia, which was substantial and real, not a gesture. Direct escalation authority. Budget for 2 additional account managers, which he would hire and oversee. And a seat at the senior leadership table on a standing basis, not as a guest. Marcus looked at the number she slid across the table. He looked at it for a beat. "This is because of Gavin," he said. "It's because of what you've been doing for 6 weeks. And because of what should have been done years ago." She held his eyes. "But yes, I had lunch with Gavin on Monday and he told me you were the person and that I should meet with you in person with a real number rather than make you ask for it." She paused. "So I'm telling you that too, because you deserve to know where the information came from." Marcus was quiet. Something moved across his face that he didn't quite manage to contain, not emotion exactly, more like the specific thing that happens when you've been unseen for a long time, and something finally looks at you directly. "Of course he did," he said, half to himself. "Do you want the role?" He looked up. "Yes, then it's yours." She extended her hand and he shook it across the table, firm, like someone who means it. "I'm going to need you to help me build the early warning system. The formal version, the one that doesn't disappear when a person leaves." "How to build it," Marcus said. "I've been thinking about it for 6 weeks. Start writing it up. We'll review it together." He left with the title and the number and the standing seat at the table, and Cassandra sat alone in her office afterward and felt, for the first time since the Thursday morning in the conference room that had set everything in motion, that she was moving in the right direction rather than just moving. It was not a feeling she mistook for arrival. She had learned something in the last 2 months about the difference between momentum and resolution, about how easy it is to convince yourself that doing things constitutes fixing things. What's actually required is slower and less visible and involves sitting with discomfort long enough to change the thing underneath the action rather than just the action itself. She was still in that process. She knew she was still in it. But she was in it honestly now, which was different from where she'd been on the morning she'd walked into that conference room with the city under her and the pressure at her back and a man trying to show her a folder she refused to open. Over the following months, North Star bled and then stabilized. The Hargrove relationship recovered gradually, not because anyone promised Phil Delaney anything, because Marcus called him directly, established a standing weekly check-in, learned his communication style, and showed up for long enough that the trust began to rebuild. Was slow. It was exactly as slow as trust is when it has been disrupted, and there was no shortcut for it, and Cassandra stopped expecting one. The Dalton expansion that Terry Albright had been quietly discussing with Gavin, that one didn't come back. Terry moved his company's growth project to a competitor who had been courting him during the uncertainty, and that loss showed up in the annual-to-end projections in a way that was real and permanent and served as its own kind of reminder. Some things you get one chance at. Some windows close while you're looking the other way, and they don't reopen. And the best you can do is understand why, and make sure you're looking next time. Brecker Wholesale was gone. Sandra Cho sent a brief, professional email 3 months after the formal departure, addressed to the new account management team, acknowledging a solid service record in the early years and wishing North Star well. It was the kind of email that's both courteous and final, and everyone who read it understood it was both. These were losses. Cassandra counted them as losses. She resisted the corporate instinct to reframe them as learning opportunities or strategic pivots, because they weren't, they were consequences, and consequences deserve to be called what they are. What she built from those consequences was something she was more careful about. The formal risk escalation protocol that she and Marcus developed over 2 months of iteration, tested, revised, tested again, created a direct channel from any level of the organization to a dedicated operations risk desk that fed into senior leadership weekly. It was not a complicated system. Its simplicity was, in fact, the point. The more layers a warning had to survive, more chances it had to disappear. They built it so that a logistics coordinator who noticed something could flag it in 4 steps and have it in front of a VP within 48 hours. Beth's routing pilot, the efficiency improvement that the previous division structured on for 5 months, became the model case study for the first all-hands presentation of the new protocol. Cassandra gave the presentation herself. She told the full story. The coordinator who had the idea, the months it sat unused, the new system that would have surfaced it in days instead of half a year. She didn't tell the other part of the story in that presentation, the part about the man whose departure had made all of this visible. But everyone in the room who had been at North Star long enough already knew it. The ones who were newer could feel the shape of it in the specific way she said the words. "We have people in this building who see things we don't see from up here," she said, standing in front of 300 employees in North Star's main conference facility, which was not the 14th floor and was not glass-topped and was deliberately not that. "I don't want to find out what they see when it's too late. I want to hear it in time to do something about it, is what this is for. And I want you to know, from me, directly, that using it is not a risk to your position here. It's the job. It's the actual job." She meant it. The people in the room, most of them, believed she meant it, because Cassandra Wren had a reputation for meaning what she said, even when what she said was uncomfortable. And she had spent the last several months demonstrating that the new things she was saying were not performance. Everyone believed it immediately. Trust, again, as slow as it always is. But the protocol was used. Within the first month, 7 flags were submitted. 3 of them identified issues that would have become actual client problems. One of them was a routing inefficiency in a Gulf Coast corridor that bore an uncomfortable resemblance to the vulnerabilities Gavin had outlined in the February risk assessment. The one that had gone nowhere had preceded the one that had preceded the storm in the crisis and the conference room, and everything that followed. This time it was caught. The adjustment was made. Client never knew there had been a near miss. Cassandra read the flag report when it came to her desk, and she thought about a 16-page document submitted through the correct channels 4 months before a storm. Juiced it ceased, and she thought about the specific cost of not reading things that people take the trouble to write. She didn't say any of this to anyone. Some reckonings are private. Across the city, Gavin's first year at Meridian moved with the particular quality of time that feels both fast and solid, the kind that produces visible results, because the foundation underneath them is being built correctly. The Central Corridor Division, which had been losing ground for 8 months when he took it over, turned its first profitable quarter at the 7-month mark. Spectacular profit, the kind that makes headlines in industry publications, the kind that produces headlines anywhere else but real, grounded on process improvements and team decisions, the slow accumulation team decisions, and the slow accumulation of a culture where people brought their actual thinking to work instead of the version of their thinking that had learned to survive the previous management. Beth's routing improvement, formalized and expanded under Gavin's authorization, was generating about 14% efficiency gains on the eastern portion of the corridor by the end of the year. She had been promoted once and had the specific quiet confidence of someone who had been seen accurately and had grown into the size of that seeing. Julio was leading the Thursday team meetings with a competence that still occasionally surprised himself, which Gavin had noticed and had never commented on directly, because some things grow better without too much attention. Team was not perfect. There were conflicts, miscommunications. Period in the 3rd month, where 2 of the senior coordinators developed a working relationship so poor that Gavin had to sit them both down separately and then together and have 3 separate uncomfortable conversations before it improved. One hire he made in the 4th month turned out to be wrong, not bad. Wrong for the role, wrong fit for the culture, and Gavin handled the separation honestly and without drama and thought about it afterward, more than he expected to. Because managing out someone who isn't working is one of the harder things in management, is that's a market thing, and the rightness doesn't make it clean. Is no version of leadership that doesn't occasionally require you to make choices that are correct and painful simultaneously. Gavin had understood this intellectually for years. Living it from the authority side rather than the receipt side was up its own education. He thought about Cassandra sometimes, moments, not with bitterness, with satisfaction, with a kind of complicated understanding that had grown gradually in the months since the lunch on Halstead. She had been in a position where the pressure and the pride and the accumulated habits of someone who had succeeded moving faster than doubt could catch her had converged at the wrong moment with the wrong target. He understood that better now than he had in the conference room. It didn't change what had word. It didn't rehabilitate or the public humiliation or the 7 years of quiet work that had been dismissed without a question. Understanding something and being damaged by it are not the same state, and at some point he couldn't have told you exactly when he had stopped carrying the conference room like a wound and started carrying it like a fact. Something that had happened, something that had changed the direction of his life in ways that were, from this distance, not entirely bad. His life had changed. That was the plain fact of it. Yes, he'd intervened. Lily started 5th grade in September and had a teacher named Gracie who came over on Fridays and ate everything in the refrigerator with the specific dedication of a child who treats someone else's kitchen as a personal opportunity. Gavin made a standing Friday dinner, nothing elaborate, usually pasta or tacos or the occasional ambitious attempt at something he'd seen in a cooking video that turned out approximately correct, and he was there for it every week. Some weeks. Every week. He was there when Lily's science project, a model of the water cycle that had required 3 nights of construction and 1 catastrophic collapse that required rebuilding from scratch, won 2nd place at the school's fall science fair. He was there in the gymnasium with the other parents, holding his phone up to take a picture that was slightly blurry because he'd fumbled the angle, and Lily had looked up from her display table and found him in the crowd immediately. The way kids find their parents in crowds, the biological certainty of it, and had given him the small nod that meant she'd seen him and that it mattered. He had been there, trying, was what he had. And he understood now, way he hadn't entirely understood before, that it was not a small thing. It was not a thing to be mentioned modestly in the gap between professional accomplishments. It was the accomplishment, or rather, it was the part of a life that makes the other accomplishments mean something rather than simply accumulating. Called his mother every Sunday. He fixed things around the house when they needed fixing instead of postponing until the next weekend and the next. He scheduled the dentist appointment and actually went. He replaced the rear brakes on the truck, which had needed it for almost a year, and which he finally took to a shop on a Saturday morning, while Lily was at a soccer clinic, sitting in the waiting room with a cup of bad coffee, and the specific, incomplete satisfaction of taking care of something that needed taking care of. It was a regular life. It was his life, actually assembled around the things that mattered rather than constructed around an absence of time for them. And the difference between those two things was considerable. The industry conference was held in the city in mid-October at a convention hotel downtown with the particular anonymous quality of convention hotels everywhere, wide carpeted hallways, too much lighting, panels on supply chain innovation and freight technology, and the future of logistics in an era of increasingly complicated global disruption. Gavin attended because David Park asked him to represent Meridian at two panel discussions, and because he had reached the point in his new role where his presence at industry events carried professional weight that was useful for the company. He saw Cassandra from across the main hall on the first afternoon, before either of them had made it to anything scheduled. She was with two people he didn't recognize, probably her new executive team, people she was meeting with, or both, and she was listening to something one of them was saying with the focused, compressed attention he had always recognized as her genuine engagement mode, distinct from the performing engagement mode that executives often deployed at events like this. She saw him at approximately the same moment, across the hall, 15 feet and a crowd of industry professionals between them. He raised a hand, a small acknowledgement. She held it for a moment, meeting his eyes across the space, and then excused herself from the people she was with and crossed toward him, which he hadn't expected but also had. Gavin, Cassandra. He glanced at the badge she was wearing, which was required for entry and which billionaires wore with the same resigned compliance as everyone else. How's North Star? Stabilizing, she said. She said it without the defensive precision of someone managing a narrative. She said it the way you describe a patient who has been through something and is recovering accurately. Doubt spin. Hargrove is rebuilding. Slowly. Marcus has been, she paused. He's been exceptional. You were right about him. I usually am about people. She looked at him. That's a joke. It's also true. The corners of his eyes. Not quite a smile. She almost smiled back. Meridian's numbers are being talked about, she said. In rooms I happen to be in. The corridor turnaround is getting attention. Team did the work. I just stopped blocking it from happening. That's leadership, though. That's actually what that is. He looked at her steadily. I know. She held his gaze for a moment. Means there was something in that exchange, two people who had been through something real together, who were standing on the other side of it, who were different from the versions of themselves that had occupied that conference room. That didn't need a lot of words. Reconciliation, exactly. Something quieter. Two people acknowledging, without performing it, that they had both learned something. Early warning protocol, he said. I heard about it through the industry. A risk management consultant mentioned it as an example of structural reform at a mid-size freight company. Didn't say which company. I should probably put our name on it. It would be honest. It would. She paused. It came from the investigation. From the lunch. She said it plainly, without maneuver. I want you to know that. It didn't come from a consultant or a board recommendation. It came from understanding what had gone wrong specifically enough to fix the actual thing, instead of a version of it that looked better in a presentation. Good, he said simply. I also want you to know. She stopped. Try it again, with the precision of someone who has thought about how to say something and still isn't sure they have it exactly right. I think about the conference room, not in a way that's useful, necessarily. But I think about it, about what I said and how I said it, and who was in the room when I said it. And I want you to know that it's not something I've packaged into a lesson and moved past. It's something I sit with. He was quiet for a moment. Around them, the conference hall hummed and moved and attended to its own business. That's probably right, he said finally. For what it's worth, I think you should sit with it. Forever. But long enough. How long is long enough? He thought about it. No, until the next moment when you're under pressure and someone is standing in front of you with something you don't want to hear. If you hear it actually, open the folder and hear it, then you've been sitting with it long enough. She looked at him. That's a very Gavin Mercer answer. Old habit, he said. For the second time, and this time it was clearly a joke, and she recognized it, and something between them loosened slightly. The specific loosening that happens when two people who have been serious about something can briefly be something other than serious about it without losing the weight of the thing. No, I should get back, she said. Two people she'd left were watching from across the hall with the patient faces of people who are pretending not to watch. Me too. He had a panel in 20 minutes. She extended her hand. He shook it the same handshake, firm and clean. It's good to see you doing well, she said. Pleasantry. An actual statement. You too, he said. And he meant that also. She walked back across the hall. He watched her go for a moment, watched her step back into the conversation she'd left, saw the way she immediately re-engaged with both people, rather than just the more senior one. And that was probably new. That specific quality of attention distributed without hierarchy, and then turned in the direction of the panel room. He had things to say today about operational resilience in high-disruption freight environments, and he had thought carefully about what he actually believed rather than what sounded good. And he was going to say the true things because that was how he did things. Now, here, in this life he had been building since a Thursday morning when he pushed a chair in neatly and walked out a door. Panel was fine. He said the true things. Someone in the back row asked a question that was actually interesting, and he answered it honestly, including the part of the answer that complicated his own earlier point. And afterward, two people came up to talk to him, and one of them turned out to be a VP from a company 3 times the size of Meridian, who had a problem that sounded, from 30 seconds of description, exactly like the February risk assessment problem. And told her to call him because he knew some things about that particular kind of problem that he was willing to talk through. He drove home at 6:15, which was when he tried to drive home now. Always. Some nights ran longer, but he tried, and when he made it matter. Lily was at the kitchen table with her homework spread across half of it when he walked in. Biscuit was under the table with his chin on her foot. The radio in the kitchen was on the station. She liked that he found barely tolerable, and the dishwasher was running through its cycle with its familiar low rumble. How was the conference? She asked without looking up. How was school? Math was bad. Everything else was okay. We can look at the math after dinner. I don't want to look at the math after dinner. We'll look at it anyway, she groaned. The specific theatrical groan of a 10-year-old who is not actually that upset. Biscuit lifted his head briefly and then put it back down. Gavin hung up his jacket, washed his hands, and opened the refrigerator to figure out dinner. There was leftover pasta and the ingredients for something more ambitious, and a collection of things that didn't go together in any obvious way, which was usually how the refrigerator looked by Thursday. I saw someone today, he said, still looking at the refrigerator. Someone from my old job, the one I left. Lily was quiet for a moment. The one that was mean to you? He almost smiled at that. The one that was mean to you. 10 years old, and the whole complex architecture of it distilled to its most essential form. That one. Was it okay? He thought about Cassandra in the convention hall, extending her hand, saying, "It's good to see you doing well," in the way that meant it. He thought about the protocol. He thought about Marcus with a title that fit and a seat at the table. Thought about the folder. Finally opened. 6 weeks too late, but opened eventually. And what that meant about whether people could actually change the parts of themselves that needed changing. He thought they could. He thought it was hard and slow and required a kind of sustained discomfort that most people tried to avoid. And he thought some people had the capacity for it and some didn't. He thought Cassandra Wren, for all her flaws and the one specific catastrophic failure that had redrawn his life, was someone who did. He said it was okay. He pulled out the pasta. Thursday night, leftover pasta was a reasonable choice, and he wasn't going to pretend otherwise. "Dad," Lily said. "Yeah." You're different now. Like you're more here. He stood at the counter with the container of pasta in his hand and looked at his daughter, was looking at him over the math homework she didn't want to do, with Biscuit's chin on her foot and the radio going and the dishwasher cycling through, and the plain ordinariness of it was almost more than he could hold, without it meaning too much. He said, "I'm working on staying that way." She nodded satisfied and went back to the homework. He heated the pasta. They ate dinner with the radio on. After they looked at the math fractions, he stopped mutes, which were Lily's specific enemy this semester, and it took 40 minutes and some negotiation about how many examples constituted adequate practice, and she got most of them right by the end. And he didn't make a bigger deal of that than it warranted, which was something he'd learned about her. She didn't need the celebration. She needed the steadiness. At 8:30, she went upstairs. Biscuit followed her, as Biscuit always did, having determined years ago which member of the household was the better option for overnight warmth. Gavin cleaned up the kitchen, wiped down the counter, ran water over the dishes, started the dishwasher again. Stood at the kitchen window, for a moment, looking at the backyard in the October, dark the oak tree and the neighbor's fence and the specific nothing in particular of a backyard at night. He thought about something he had told David Park in the first interview, that he needed to be able to leave at a predictable time 3 days a week. Intervened, and that it needed to be understood that he would do the work, but he wasn't going to perform availability as a substitute for actual performance. He had set it as a condition. He understood now that it was also a philosophy. Set sitsen, that the same distinction applied everywhere to leadership, to parenthood, to the choices you make about what to spend yourself on and what to protect from the spending. He had spent himself in the wrong places for a long time. Wasted, he had done real work that produced real results and helped real people keep their jobs, and clients keep their supply chains, and a company function better than it would have without him. None of that was nothing. But he had done it inside a structure that had no interest in what it cost him, and he had told himself for 7 years that the trade was acceptable. And one Thursday morning, a woman he'd worked for had said 5 words, and the trade had revealed itself plainly. He didn't regret the years at North Star. He had learned things there that he used every day. He had become someone at North Star, developed judgment and patience and the specific operational fluency that made him good at the thing he was built to do. Those 7 years were in him, producing results at Meridian, producing the way he handled Beth's routing idea, producing the 3 separate uncomfortable conversations that had repaired a broken working relationship in his 3rd month, producing the card he gave to the VP at the conference today, who had a problem he knew how to think about. He didn't regret the years. He regretted how slowly he had learned what they were costing. Regret with that specific shape, the kind that teaches you something, rather than just sitting on you, is bearable. It has a function. It points at something you can actually use going forward, rather than just making you smaller around the thing you can't change. He turned off the kitchen light, went to check that the back door was locked, came back through the living room and sat for a moment in the quiet, the house breathing around him, the specific peace of a home where a child is asleep upstairs and a dog is keeping watch and the dishes are clean and the homework is done. He thought about something Lily had asked him that night before the lunch with Cassandra. Yes, is it easier to be angry or to let it go? And no, it isn't. The binary certainty of a 10-year-old who hasn't yet learned that adults complicate things that don't need to be complicated. She'd intervened. She was right. She was usually right about the things that mattered in who looks at something, of someone who looks at something and says what it is. Hope she kept that. He hoped the years didn't wear it down into the sophisticated capacity for self-deception that most adults had developed by the time they were old enough to need it less. His job, he had come to understand, was not to protect her from the difficulty. The difficulty was coming regardless. His job was to be there, consistently and honestly, so that when the difficulty arrived, she had a model for how a person moves through hard things without becoming dishonest about them. That was the job. The other job, the one with the title and the salary and the corridor division and the standing Thursday team meetings, that was work. Important work, work he was good at and cared about. But it was work. It lived in its appropriate place now, in its properly proportioned space, rather than occupying the position that everything else got arranged around. He sat for another minute in the quiet living room. Outside, the neighborhood was doing the particular things neighborhoods do at 9 on a Thursday in October, a dog somewhere down the block, a car passing slowly, porch light coming on across the street. Thing that required anything of him. His work phone was on the counter in the kitchen. He had looked at it after dinner. There was an email from David about a vendor call tomorrow and a message from Beth about the quarterly numbers, and he had decided those would be there in the morning, which they would be, because the thing about tomorrow's work is that it is always there in the morning, and the thing about tonight is that it was not going to be there again. He got up, turned off the living room light, went upstairs, stopped at Lily's door, which was half open the way it always was. Biscuit was at the foot of her bed, already asleep, making the small sounds that dogs make when they've settled in for the night. Lily was on her side, one arm outside the covers, the math homework on her desk where she'd left it, the science fair ribbon second place, the slightly blurry photo tacked to the corkboard above her desk. He stood there for a moment, not doing anything, just standing in the doorway of his daughter's room at 9 on a Thursday in October, in the house he rented in the neighborhood where people didn't lock their cars. 32 years old, with a job that asked the right things of him, and a team that was becoming something, and a life that was imperfect, unfinished, still being worked out in real time, genuinely his. He pulled the door to its half-open position and went to bed. In the morning, Lily would steal his strawberries. He already knew this, and he had already decided he would have extras on the side because she was going to steal them. Some things you stop trying to prevent and start simply making room for, because they're not problems, they're just the texture of a life that belongs to you. He turned off the light. Outside, the neighborhood settled into the particular quiet of October nights, and the city went on doing what cities do, indifferent and constant, and somewhere across it, a woman was probably working late in an office on the 14th floor, sitting with something she hadn't yet finished. Sitting with, building something from the remains of a mistake she had been honest enough not to explain away. And in a house on a quiet street, a man who had once given 7 years to a job that didn't see him was lying in the dark, afraid of tomorrow, running from yesterday, performing anything for anyone. Just there, finally, reliably, completely there. That was the whole of it. That was what all of it had been for.